The war world of Eth did not look like a place that had ever held life. From orbit, it was gray and brown, scarred deep by weapons that had no names in civilian language. The Coalition outpost Dale 9 floated above it like a nail driven into nothing, and inside that outpost, at roughly 3 in the morning by ship's time, Sergeant Dario Vance sat alone in Cargo Bay 7 and talked to the dark. He was not losing his mind. He knew that. He had checked, more than once, with the kind of flat honesty that comes from having nothing left to protect. He talked to the dark because silence was worse, and because there was nobody awake to hear him, and because saying the names of his old unit out loud, even to nothing, felt like the only way to prove they had existed. He did this most nights. Nobody on the station knew. He was not the sort of man people noticed. That was not self-pity. It was a fact, in the same way that the cargo bay was cold, and the lights on the D-level corridor always flickered at the 4th panel. Dario was medium height, medium build, with the kind of face that blended into any group photograph. 12 years in the Coalition ground forces had not made him hard or loud or impressive. It had made him very, very quiet. He was on Dale 9 because someone had to be, and he had no objection to anything anymore. The reason the rest of the station was buzzing, the reason Dario had to come to Cargo Bay 7 in the first place, because the usual corridors were full of noise, was the eggs. 5 of them, recovered from the ruins of Old Aveth 3 weeks ago by a survey team who had stopped breathing for a full minute when they found them. Dragon eggs. Real ones. Confirmed by 4 separate scientific teams from 4 different species, all of whom had spent the last 3 weeks arguing about what to do next and accidentally agreeing to do nothing while they argued. Dario had heard about the eggs the same way he heard about most things on the station, from Corporal Sienna Faro, who appeared at his elbow without warning and talked until she felt he had enough information to survive. "They're bringing in specialists," she had said, handing him a cup of something hot that was technically coffee. "Velhari scientists. A Garathi military delegation. Some kind of elder from a species nobody's sure is still alive. The whole station is going to smell like ambition for the next 2 weeks." "Right," Dario had said. "You could at least pretend to care." "I care," he said. "I'm just quiet about it." She had looked at him for a moment with the particular expression she reserved for things she chose not to push on. Then she left. That had been 4 days ago. The specialists were here now. Dario had passed 3 Velhari scientists in the corridor that afternoon, tall and bioluminescent, and speaking in rapid, overlapping tones, and a pair of Garathi soldiers who took up most of the hallway and looked at him the way large things look at small things, with the mild surprise of something that did not expect to encounter anything interesting and was not wrong. He had stepped aside. They had walked past. Life continued. The eggs were housed in the lab bay on sea level, in a sealed and climate-controlled chamber that Dario had no reason to enter and no interest in approaching. He had his perimeter checks. He had his logistics reports. He had Cargo Bay 7 at 0300. He was walking back from his check, hands in his jacket, taking the long route, because the long route went past the viewport that faced the planet, and he liked to look at Aveth. He was not sure why. He had been on Aveth, once, in a different war, and it had been the last place he had seen most of the people whose names he still said in the dark. Looking at it did not make him feel better. It made him feel accurate. There was a difference. He passed the sea-level lab bay. Through the narrow viewport in the sealed door, he could see the containment chamber faintly lit, and the 5 eggs in their cradles, and a Velhari technician at a monitor station making quiet notes. He stopped for no reason he could name. 4 of the eggs were still. The 5th, slightly smaller, slightly darker than the others, had been vibrating for 3 days straight, according to the report Sienna had mentioned. The scientists did not know what it meant. Every instrument they had gave a different reading. It was the problem egg, the concerning one, the one nobody had a good answer for. As Dario stood at the viewport, the 5th egg went still. Not gradually, not winding down. It simply stopped, between 1 second and the next, as though something inside it had finally found what it was waiting for. Dario stood there a moment longer, not sure what he had just seen. Then he finished his walk, went back to his bunk, and was asleep within 4 minutes, the fastest he had fallen asleep in 3 years. He did not notice that part, but his body did. In the lab bay, the Velhari technician looked at the monitor, then at the egg, then at the empty corridor visible through the viewport. She typed a short note. Then she looked at it for a long time. Then she deleted it, because she could not explain it, and unexplained things made for very bad reports. The egg stayed still all night. The hatching started without a single instrument catching it early. There were 17 specialists in the observation gallery above the lab bay when the first egg moved. Velhari scientists with handheld scanners. 2 Garathi military observers in full dress uniform. A pair of human xenobiologists who had waited their entire careers for this exact moment and were now gripping each other's arms without realizing it. Commander Oral Sath of the Velhari Coalition delegation stood at the center of the gallery with the posture of someone who had already prepared 3 speeches for 3 different outcomes. The first egg opened, and the hatchling inside looked up at the gallery. It looked at the gathered faces, curious, hungry, eager, performing calm, and it pulled itself into a tight curl and went completely still. Not asleep. Still. The way a creature goes still when it decides the room is wrong. The scientists exchanged looks. Commander Sath made a note. The second egg opened. Same thing. The hatchling took one long look at the assembled observers and tucked its head under its own wing and did not move again. The third and fourth followed within the hour. For hatchlings. For retreats. The gallery had gone from excited to confused to quietly humiliated because nobody wanted to say the obvious thing, which was that 4 baby dragons had looked at the most impressive gathering of coalition specialists assembled in a decade and chosen to pretend they did not exist. The 5th egg did not open. Hours passed. The gallery slowly emptied. Dignitaries had schedules. Scientists had data to argue about. By the end of the second shift, the observation gallery above the sea-level lab bay had only 2 people in it. A Velhari junior technician running automated monitors and nobody else, because the corridor camera showed the gallery as empty. Down in the actual corridor, not the gallery, but the plane maintenance corridor that ran alongside the lab bay's secondary wall, 2 guards stood rotation. One was Corporal Sienna Faro. The other was Sergeant Dario Vance, assigned by the duty roster, present because the roster said to be there and for no other reason. Sienna was reading something on her personal unit. Dario was standing with his hands behind his back, looking at the wall in the specific way he looked at walls when he was thinking about something he was not going to say. The 5th egg opened between one breath and the next. No sound, no light, no drama. The dark-scaled hatchling inside simply unfolded herself from the interior, slowly, the way something does when it has been waiting a long time and is in no hurry now that the wait is over. She was small, smaller than the others. Her scales were the color of deep water in low light, and her eyes, when they opened, were the pale gold of old bone. She did not look at the ceiling where the gallery was. She did not look at the Velhari technician at the monitor station. She turned her head, slowly, toward the secondary wall, the maintenance corridor side, and she looked directly at the narrow strip of viewport set into it. Dario was not looking at the viewport. He was looking at the wall. But something made him turn, the way something sometimes makes a person turn toward a window they cannot explain why they noticed, and he looked through the glass into the lab bay. The hatchling was already looking at him. She crossed the incubation surface without hurry, not rushing, not scrambling, walking, with the deliberate steadiness of something that knows exactly where it is going. She reached the secondary wall and pressed her face against the containment glass at the exact spot where Dario stood on the other side. He did not step back. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Between them was a sheet of reinforced glass designed to contain environments rated for creatures 20 times her current size, and neither of them paid any attention to it. Sienna looked up from her unit. She looked at the hatchling. She looked at Dario. She looked at the hatchling again. Dario, she said, very quietly. I see it, he said. She's looking at you. I know. Only at you. She's not looking at me at all. I'm standing right here. I know. He did not know what to do. He had not known what to do about most things for several years and had developed a patient relationship with that feeling, but this was different. The hatchling had pressed her face to the glass and closed her eyes, and the expression on her face, and Dario would later be very reluctant to use this word, but Sienna would use it first, so it was officially not his fault, was relief. Sienna hit the alarm. The gallery refilled faster than it had emptied. Commander Sath came at a controlled jog that she would never admit was a jog. 3 Velhari scientists came through the main lab door, and stopped dead when they saw the hatchling pressed against the secondary wall. A Garathi observer appeared in the corridor doorway, took in the scene, and said something in his own language that the translator rendered as a question about geometry. They found the fifth hatchling asleep, curled as small as she could make herself, pressing every available inch of her body against the glass. On the other side of the glass, Sergeant Dario Vance stood with his hand pressed flat against the surface from his side, not sure when he had done that, not taking it away. Commander Sath looked at the hatchling. She looked at the sergeant. She looked at her notes, which were extensive, and none of which covered this. "This is not," she said carefully, "what I prepared for." Sienna, who had been watching the whole thing, said, "She didn't choose him like she found him. She chose him like she'd already been looking." Nobody had a better explanation. Nobody would for some time. High War Master Dren of the Garathi Dominion arrived on Dale 9:31 hours after the hatching, which was faster than anyone thought possible, and which told Commander Sath everything she needed to know about how seriously the Garathi were taking this. Dren was large even by Garathi standards, a species that averaged 2.5 meters and built their warships with high ceilings on purpose. He wore his rank markings in the traditional way, pressed into the scaled skin of his forearms rather than displayed on fabric, and he had the manner of a being who had never once waited for a room to quiet down before speaking. He reviewed the footage of the hatching for 4 minutes. Then he said, "This is an imprinting error." Commander Sath, who had been reviewing the same footage for 31 hours and had 17 competing theories, none of which she liked, said, "There is no documented precedent for imprinting in dragon species." "Then it is an anomaly." "That is possible." "The creature chose based on proximity. The human happened to be at the wall. It will transfer." Sath looked at her notes. The other 4 hatchlings were surrounded by far more beings at the time of their emergence and chose none of them. Dren did not answer that. He looked at the footage again, specifically at the part where the hatchling, already called Rail by the station staff, a name that had spread through the crew faster than any official designation, pressed her face to the glass and went still. He looked at Dario's hand on the other side of the glass. "I want the bond tested," he said. "Separate them. Controlled conditions. 72 hours. Sath considered objecting. She had enough scientific reason to. But she also needed Dren's cooperation on 17 other things, and the test was, scientifically speaking, valid. 48 hours, she said. And I run the monitoring. Dario was told about the test by Sath in person. He listened. He said, "All right." Then he said, "Is she going to be okay?" And when Sath told him the hatchling would be safe and monitored, he nodded and went to his temporary holding room without another word. Sienna walked him there. She asked, in the corridor, quiet enough that the Garathi escort could not hear, "Do you want me to argue this?" "I can argue this. I have feelings about this." "It's a valid test," Dario said. "You're not a lab condition, Dario." "They don't know that yet," he said. "Let them find out." He sat in the holding room. He looked at the wall. He did the thing he always did, which was to take the weight of whatever was happening and find its shape and fit himself around it, because that was the only technique he had that still worked. In the lab bay, Rail did not rage. That was the thing that confused Dren most. He had expected a creature separated from a bond partner to thrash, to fight, to attempt escape. Instead, Rail sat in the center of the containment chamber and went quiet in a way that the Velhari instruments struggled to categorize. Her psionic output did not spike. It dropped, slowly, steadily, to a level the scanners barely registered. Not shut down. Withdrawal. The way a fire pulls itself inward when the wind gets cold. Sath logged it as cognitive withdrawal. Sienna, reviewing the footage from the corridor, said it more plainly. She's grieving. You can see it in her whole body. By hour 20, the other 4 hatchlings had started doing something unusual. They had begun orienting themselves toward the wall of the lab bay that faced the direction of Dario's holding room. Not watching it, not moving toward it, just facing it, the way a plant faces light it cannot reach. Sath logged that too, without comment. At hour 31, Dario was sitting on the floor of his holding room. The bunk was fine, but the floor was better. He had spent enough time on bad ground that floors felt honest, and he was saying names quietly to the wall when he heard something. Not a sound exactly. More like a pressure behind his eyes, warm and very faint, the way the memory of a good thing sometimes feels when it surfaces without warning. Then the door opened. Not the lock mechanism, not the release handle. The door itself, solid composite, rated for pressure differential and equipped with 2 separate seal systems, simply opened. The metal showed no damage. The seals were intact on both sides. By every measurement taken afterward, the door had not opened. And yet it was open, and Rail walked through it with the careful step of something that has figured out a new trick and is still slightly surprised it worked. She crossed the room. She sat on his boots. She looked up at him. Dario looked down at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I was going to be there in 17 hours. She put her chin on his knee. The door was locked, he said. She closed her eyes. He sat there for a moment, and then, because there was nothing else to do, he put his hand on her back and went back to his quiet. She stayed still under his hand, warm and steady, and her psionic output, which was being monitored by instruments 3 corridors away, climbed back to double its baseline and held there like a flag in calm air. The test was declared over. Commander Sath reviewed the door data for 2 days and wrote, at the end of her report, a single sentence in her personal log that she did not include in the official version. "I do not know what she walked through. I do not think it was the door." Dren said nothing for a long time. Then he said they would need outside expertise. Sath agreed. She already knew who to call. The Velamity were not quite extinct. That was the closest anyone could get to a clean answer about them. Their sanctuary world of Death Sun was real and had a confirmed location, but getting a response from it required a specific kind of long-range communication that most modern systems no longer carried the hardware for, because most modern systems had written the Velamity off as a historical footnote rather than a living civilization. Commander Sath had the hardware. She had also, over the course of a very long career, developed the habit of keeping records that other people considered too old to matter. The Velamity elder who responded to her transmission was called Whisper by the Coalition personnel who had contact with them, a name given because the actual designation existed in a frequency range that caused feedback in standard audio systems. Whisper appeared on the communication screen as a faint shape, wrapped in something between cloth and membrane, very still, with eyes that caught the transmission light and held it longer than they should have. Sath presented the situation plainly. Dragon egg recovery. 5 hatchlings. 4 in withdrawal. 1 bonded, apparently and completely, to a human soldier of no particular rank or distinction. Separation test inconclusive due to the hatchling breaching a sealed door by means that remained unexplained. Whisper listened without interrupting, which was already unusual for any species Sath had dealt with. Then Whisper said, in the slow and precise cadence of something that has said careful things for a very long time, "What did your instruments measure when the creature pressed herself against the barrier toward the human?" Psionic output doubled. Neural coherence stabilized. Stress indicators dropped to baseline. And when they were separated? Output dropped. Withdrawal state. She was quiet. In a way our instruments did not have a good category for. That category, Whisper said, is grief. Dren, who was in the room against Sath's preference, made a sound. Whisper did not look toward where the sound came from. Dragons do not read thoughts, Whisper continued. They do not read capability. They do not read strength or rank or biological fitness. They read what we once called the true shape of a self. A pause. Every being has one. It is built from every experience they have carried, every loss, every act of care, every moment they chose to endure rather than close. It is not visible to most species because most species are not looking for it. They are looking for what they are told to look for. And the dragon looks for something different, Sath said. The dragon looks for honesty. Not virtue. Not goodness. Honesty of the interior. A self that has been fully inhabited, that has not retreated from its own experience, even the painful parts. Most beings, when they know they are being evaluated, perform. They show the version of themselves they want to be seen as. It is instinct. It is what civilizations teach. Dren said, flatly, and the human was not performing. Whisper turned, very slowly, toward where Dren's voice had come from. Your warrior classes perform from birth. It is admirable in its way, but it leaves very little of the original self visible. The silence in the room was the kind that felt physical. Humans, Whisper said, are unusual. Not all of them. But some of your kind carry grief in a way that is remarkable, open, undefended. a grief that has not been converted into anger or ambition or ritual. It simply remains, present and honest, like an open sky, to a dragon that reads as the most rare thing in the room. Sath thought of Dario sitting in the holding room, of the footage of him with his hand on the glass, of the way he had said, about the separation test. It's valid, let them find out, with the flat acceptance of someone who had run out of things to protect. She did not choose him because he was broken, Sath said, slowly. She chose him because he was not pretending he wasn't. Whisper did not confirm or deny. Whisper simply looked at her with those light-catching eyes and said, "Now you understand." Dren left the room before the transmission ended. Sath did not go after him. That evening, she walked to the station corridor where she knew Dario would be doing his perimeter check, and she stood at the corner and watched for a moment before he saw her. He was walking at his usual unhurried pace, and Rael, already larger, already the size of a medium dog, growing faster than any documented juvenile rate, walked beside him with her head level with his hip. They were not talking. They were not performing companionship. They were simply present in the same space, moving in the same direction, and the rhythm of it was so settled that it looked like something that had always existed and was only now visible. Rael noticed Sath first. She turned her head and looked at the commander with calm, assessing eyes. Not hostile, not curious, exactly. More like she was reading something and finding it roughly what she expected. Dario turned when Rael looked. He saw Sath. He waited. Sath opened her mouth to say something scientific, something properly framed and professionally distanced. Instead, she said, "How long has she been growing this fast?" "For days," he said. "Are you sleeping?" He considered this, which was already unusual, because most people answered that question automatically. "Better than I was," he said. "She wakes up when I do. When I can't sleep. She doesn't do anything. She just stays awake with me." Sath made a note on her unit. Then she put the unit away, which she almost never did in the field. "Sergeant," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology for the separation test." Dario looked at her for a moment. "It was valid," he said. "It was insufficient," she said. "There is a difference." She looked at Rael. She knew what she was doing before we did. We should have trusted that earlier. Rael blinked once, slowly, and went back to watching the corridor. Sath walked away with the particular feeling of a scientist who has just learned something real, which is never comfortable, and is always worth it. The mission order came through official channels, which was the first sign something was wrong. Dario had been in the coalition forces long enough to know the difference between orders that came from genuine operational need and orders that came from someone who wanted a specific outcome and had enough rank to dress it up as logistics. The surface survey of Avetha's northern grid had his name on it because, the official reason read, his prior ground experience on the planet made him an asset for terrain navigation. This was true. It was also the kind of truth that gets used when the real reason won't survive a direct look. He brought this to Sienna, who read the order, read it again, and said, "Dren, that's my read. He can't separate you officially anymore. Not after the door thing. Not after Whisper's testimony on the record." She set the order down. "So he sends you somewhere with residual weapon signatures and atmospheric instability and waits to see what happens." "It's not a death sentence," Dario said. "The area's been partially cleared. It's just not fully cleared. Subtle difference. He's not trying to kill me. He's trying to prove I'm a liability." Sienna looked at him. "And if something goes wrong down there? Then he has documentation that I'm unsuitable for bond proximity. For Rael's safety." He said it flatly, the way he said things that he had already looked at from every side and accepted the shape of. "I'm going." "Of course you are," she said. "That's the only move that doesn't give him what he wants." What Dren had not planned for, because nobody had thought to explicitly tell him, was that Rael had grown another 15 centimeters in the 4 days since Sath's corridor conversation. She was no longer a creature that could be kept in a lab bay carrier. She was the size of a large dog, opinionated about where she went, and the station's medical officer, a Velhari doctor named Set who had spent 3 days reviewing Whisper's complete testimony, had flatly refused to authorize the sedation that separation now required. So Rael was cleared for the surface mission, because she was bonded, because separation was now a medical issue, because nobody with the right credentials would sign the form that said otherwise. Dren reviewed this development without visible reaction, which Sath observed and noted. Avetha's northern grid was worse than the survey map suggested. The atmospheric interference was real, not dangerous by itself, but enough to make scanning unreliable and communication patchy. The survey team moved in a careful line through what had once been a city and was now geometry, the shapes that buildings leave when everything soft about them is gone. Dario walked point, not because anyone told him to, but because he had walked point on enough ruined worlds to do it without thinking. Rael moved beside him. She was quiet in the way she was always quiet, not suppressed, just present, with all her attention going outward rather than into sound. They were 40 minutes into the grid when the automated systems woke up. Old Garathi perimeter defense units. The survey report had listed them as inactive. The survey report had been wrong by roughly 40%, which in active combat is the kind of error that ends things. The targeting systems came online from 3 directions at once, drawn by movement and biological signatures, and the survey team went flat behind the nearest available cover, which was not much, because the northern grid had been cleared of most cover by the same war that had installed the defense units. Dario counted the team. 6 people plus Rael. He counted the active emitters he could see. He counted the angles. He had done this calculation, or versions of it, more times than he could accurately remember, and his brain ran it now with the specific blankness of very deep habit. Not fear, not adrenaline, just the cold arithmetic of who was where and what could be moved without being seen. 3 emitters, he said, quiet and even. Left one is on a sweep cycle, 6 seconds between passes. Right one has a dead angle northeast about 40 degrees. Middle one is the problem. He looked at the nearest piece of solid ground. We move on my count, left, right, left, and we use the middle one's own scan interval to blind it to the northeast pair. He stopped. Because Rael had stepped out from behind cover. Not running, not attacking. She walked to the center of the open space between the team and the nearest emitter, and she stood there, and something happened that Dario felt before he saw it. A warmth that spread outward from her like heat from a fire, but slower, deeper, the way a sound fills a room rather than striking it. The emitters stopped moving. All 3 of them, mid-sweep, mid-cycle, just stopped. The targeting systems ran their scans and found nothing, because Rael had extended her psionic field outward, around the team, around herself, covering every human present, and the biological signature readers that the emitters relied on registered the entire group as a single organism. One signature, one entity. And whatever their targeting criteria was, one entity, standing still in open ground, did not meet it. The scans ran twice more. Then the emitters went back to passive mode. Sienna, from behind cover, let out a breath that was not quite a word. The Velhari member of the survey team made a sound that the translator did not attempt. Dario looked at Rael, who had walked back to his side, and was looking up at him with that familiar gold-pale gaze that did not ask for praise and did not perform calm, and simply was what it was. He put his hand on her back. She leaned slightly into it. The team extracted without further incident. Dario wrote his after-action report in the same plain language he always used, and it said what had happened, and it did not editorialize. Dren read it the same evening. He sat in his quarters with the report on the screen for a long time. Then he opened a separate channel and requested, in his official capacity, the full recorded testimony of the Vel Amati Elder Whisper. He did not explain why. He did not send a message to Sath. He did not revisit his formal opposition to the bond in writing. He simply stamped the mission completed with distinction and filed it. That, for a Garathi war master, was as close to an apology as the language allowed. 1 year after the hatching, Commander Oral Sath published a paper. It was 47 pages long, included testimony from the Vel Amati Elder Whisper, field data from Dale 9 and Aveth, and a new theoretical framework for psionic bonding that overturned 3 prior models considered settled for over a century. The coalition scientific community received it with the specific energy of people who are impressed and annoyed at the same time. In the acknowledgments, near the end, Sath had written, "Special recognition is owed to the human logistics sergeant whose inconvenient grief made everything necessary." Dario read this in the mess hall at Dale 9, where he was still stationed, still a sergeant, having refused promotion 3 separate times with the same short response, "I'm fine where I am." That had stopped being bureaucratically acceptable and had then become bureaucratically unstoppable through sheer repetition. He read the acknowledgement line twice. Then he turned the unit around and showed it to Sienna. Sienna read it. Then she laughed until her eyes watered, in the way that only very tired people laugh, when something is both funny and exactly right. She handed the unit back and wiped her face and said, "Inconvenient grief. They gave you a whole framework and called you inconvenient. I've been called worse." In your own citation. Rael, who was lying along the length of the mess hall bench with her head on Dario's knee, opened one eye at the sound of Sienna's laughter. She had grown to roughly the size of a large horse in a year, which had required 3 separate modification orders for station doorways and 1 full renovation of the quarters they shared. The engineers had done this without complaint, which was itself a sign of how much things had changed, because engineers always complain. She was present at coalition diplomatic sessions now. That had started 6 months ago, when a particularly difficult negotiation between the Garathi Dominion and a smaller border species had stalled on the 3rd day, with both parties insisting the other was negotiating in bad faith. Someone, Sath believed it was one of the human delegation members, though nobody admitted it, had suggested bringing Rael in. Not as a threat, just as a presence. Rael had walked in, looked at both delegations, and then walked to the Garathi side of the table and sat directly in front of their lead negotiator and looked at him. Just looked at him. For about 40 seconds. The lead negotiator had then, without explanation, revised 2 of his core positions. The agreement was reached by the end of the day. Nobody asked Rael what she had seen. Nobody was sure they wanted to know. She could not be bribed, flattered, or politically managed. She attended sessions when Dario attended, because she went where Dario went. She was calm, observant, and absolutely indifferent to rank. She had once sat in the coalition high chair, the seat reserved for the presiding authority of any formal session, for 20 minutes before anyone could figure out how to ask her to move, because asking a dragon to move from a chair it has chosen is not covered in any coalition protocol document. Dario had eventually said, "Rael, come on," and she had climbed down and gone to stand beside him, and the session had continued. He did not have a title for what he was. Bonded partner was the official designation. Handler was what the station staff used affectionately. Sienna called him the dragon's person, which he said nothing about and did not correct. What he was, practically, was present. He went where she went. He slept in the same room. He ate at the same time. He did his logistics work on a unit he could carry, and Rael would lie nearby and breathe with the slow, deep regularity of something that was not asleep but was very content. He still woke some nights at 0300, still felt the shape of what he had lost, still said the names sometimes when the weight of it was particular. The difference was that now, when he woke, Rael was already awake. Not reacting to him waking. Already awake, and already watching him, as though she had been keeping watch and would continue to do so for as long as it took. She did not fix him. That was the thing he had needed to understand, and that he had come to understand slowly, in the way he came to understand most things, by sitting with it long enough for it to become clear. She was not a cure. She was not an answer. She was simply a presence that would not pretend the grief was not there, because she could not pretend. She read too clearly for that. And so instead she simply refused to let him carry it in the dark alone. It was enough. It was, some nights, everything. The last evening of that first year, they were on a coalition terrace on the headquarters world, where Dario had been assigned to a liaison post that everyone knew was a diplomatic post that they had not given the diplomatic title, because he would have refused it. 3 moons were up, 2 bright, and 1 a faint smudge near the horizon. Rael was watching them with the focused attention she gave to things she found worth seeing. Dario started talking. Not about the mission, not about the paper, not about any of the things that had happened in the year since the hatching. He started talking about his old unit. Their names. What they had been like. The joke their medic always made when things were bad. The way their communications officer ate with both hands and never apologized for it. The way they had played cards badly and argued about rules and gone quiet all at once when the sky above a Veth had changed. He had never said these things out loud before. Not to anyone. Not in the dark, alone, in cargo bays. He said names there, but not stories. Stories were different. Stories meant you expected someone to receive them. Rael did not look at him while he talked. She kept watching the moons. But her breathing changed, deepened slightly, The way it did when she was giving something her full attention, and she was warm against his side, and steady, and when he eventually ran out of words, she stayed exactly where she was. The last line of Satha's paper had read, "The dragon did not choose the strongest heart in the room. She chose the most honest one. In 12 years of field research, I have come to believe these are rarely the same thing, and that the galaxy has spent considerable effort pretending otherwise." Dario had not read that far into the paper yet, but he would, and when he did, he would show it to Sienna, and she would laugh, and Rael would open one eye from where she was resting, and then close it again. Some things do not need to be explained. They only need to be witnessed.